contemporary artists, some of their common concerns or the lack of common concerns. And also this talk will be in English today, but he speaks Chinese, so I guess we can address questions if you have questions in Chinese. Or if you have some translation problems or questions, feel free to ask the speaker.
Sure, I'll also take questions in Dutch, so.
Yeah.
And or C++. So before I actually talk a little bit more about my experiences, because we have a pretty diverse audience of people who have varying degrees of knowledge and lack of knowledge about my field, which for better or for worse is Chinese contemporary art, CCA. I'm going to start with a really brief overview about some of the founding myths of what Chinese contemporary art is. And I'm founding this talk searching for Chinese contemporary art because my PowerPoint keeps crashing, so I'm really just going to have to take you through Google with me as we search for Chinese contemporary art. So we're going to start with searching for Chinese. Then after that, so there you go, Chinese. Don't search Asian. Asian gives you porn. We're going to go contemporary, right? Which is going to give you, surprisingly, kind of, houses. And then we're going to search for art, which gives you sort of what I studied in bachelor's, which was bad painting. And so if you kind of mix this bad painting and this kind of nice, if you mix bad paintings and nice buildings, what you kind of get is Chinese contemporary art. So I'll just show you that. So is there anyone here that anyone can recognize any of these artists? Who all do you see? Name names. Yes, there's Minjun, who's the laughing people, funny guy. Anyone else? This is Zhang Xiaogang. This is actually Warhol, I think. So, and this is there's probably Zheng Fanzhi is also here. I think that's him. So those are some of the founding people from the 90s. And Chinese contemporary art is really a field that takes shape in the 90s. And that's kind of weird because presumably there were Chinese people making art and they thought they were alive in the now, right, contemporary, before them. So one of the really important things about Chinese contemporary art, because there's a few really important figures, these are all painters, but there's a few other really well-known Chinese contemporary artists you probably all know as well. The main people that I would say off the top of my head are Ai Weiwei, Huang Yongping, if you have any connection to France, you know him very well. Also Xu Bing, and also Cai Guoqiang. So these are the important people in Chinese contemporary art, and they all came out in the 90s, and they're all this kind of post-60s generation. So it's like a very weird, very unified concept in a lot of ways. And I think it's important sometimes to think why Chinese contemporary art was so successful in a big way when Russian contemporary art and Indian contemporary art didn't work out in the same way in the market. I was talking to a Russian friend the other day, and he said, she said, one of the things we think about is like, where did we go wrong? Everything was going so well, and then we just disappeared off the market. That didn't happen with China. China stayed on. China was hot. China was fresh. Something clicked in the 90s for that. One of the things about Chinese contemporary art that's important to know too is that, how would you define contemporary art? Like, there's several definitions. You want to give me something in 3 words or less? You can throw something at me. And this is kind of TED Talky, so work with me. So, one idea of contemporary art is it's art that's made right now, right? And there's another idea of contemporary art, this doesn't quite apply in the Chinese context because contemporary art means one type of art, and there's 2 whole art markets. So, does anyone know what the Hu Run report is? The Hu Run report. Yeah. So it's a report of the 100 richest people in China. It's also called the butcher block because the people on that report get killed every year or 2 because they've done something corrupt to get on it, and then their people who support them fall out of flour. And so it's also called the butcher block. So they also put out a 100 most expensive artists list. And the thing about that 100 most expensive artists list is it has no overlap with everything we call Chinese contemporary art. So there's at least 100 artists there who are all selling paintings or art sculptures for over $1 million each who are not considered Chinese contemporary art. And that's because there's 2 whole universes in Chinese art that are kind of parallel. One of them is the world of ink painting and traditional oil painting that that's often supported directly by the government. And I don't mean by subsidies, but I mean by like really rich officials, like, you know, patting each other on the back. And then there's the other one, which is the field that I'm in, which is more connected to the international art world. It's helped by places like Art Basel and Museum of Modern Art. That's the place that I'm talking about. So what we'll be talking about this whole time about Chinese contemporary art, which is not just art that's right now, but a specific style of art that became important in the 90s in China. So this takes me to my next slide. This is a good example of an artist that you've never heard of who's worth more than, like, you know, the last 18 generations of wealth in your family. This is Cui Wuzhuo's work. He kind of got in the news recently for becoming the most expensive Chinese artist alive. Also was in the news 2 years ago because one of his paintings was thrown out by the custodial staff after an auction because they didn't realize it was art. Everyone sued the auction house because it was $22 million, which got thrown out. And he modestly said that he hopes for a greater future for Chinese art, which could only be shown by his works becoming more expensive than Van Gogh's work. So he's like a really humble guy who has, you know, the interest of China. Here you can see him. That's it. So let's just give you an idea of how there's a kind of a schizophrenic art world there, right? In the US, you also have this division between contemporary and people who kind of don't get to be like right now, like they're like passe or something. We usually use the word Sunday painters for that, you know, as if like only works made on Saturday are good. And so one of the things that's difficult when talking about contemporary Chinese art is that there's a lack of institutions that are there to tell you exactly what contemporary Chinese art is. So part of the way that you find out what contemporary art is you go to the trusted sources. You go to places like PS1 or the MoMA, or you go to, I don't know, the Hammer Museum, or specific, you go to the Venice Biennial, there's specific things. But you have a lack of those institutions in China. So for example, and part of the reason for that is, let me give you an idea, is you have an overwhelming reliance on private funders. So this is the Ullens Contemporary Center, the Center for Contemporary Art, which was one of the most important ones when it opened a few years ago. It was founded by toilet paper tycoons from Belgium, and they put an enormous amount of money into it, I think like $2 million a year, and then they drew out. And when they drew out, all of a sudden they're like, okay, we need to find $6 million like now. So what they did was they started like basically selling their space to do shows, which is why they recently put a show on of this guy's work, Michael Chow, who's the owner of Mr. Chow's. It's a British Chinese food chain, and his paintings look like this. So the UCCA, which is supposed to be the organization that tells you what contemporary Chinese art is, did a show of this guy's paintings. You know. So when something like that can happen in 3 years, and you don't have any institutional longevity, that's the kind of messy thing that can happen. Part of the reason that Chinese contemporary art doesn't have a strong infrastructure is because it's basically built on the ruins of the avant-garde from the 80s and the 90s. So there were some crazy things happening in the 80s and the 90s after liberalization. I don't know, has anyone heard of the artist Zhu Yu? Okay, so Zhu Yu quite famously, let's see if we can find him. I'm going to come to an engineer's LinkedIn profile. So Zhu Yu famously claimed that he ate a fetus, right, as a piece of performance art. Yeah, the government didn't really know how to respond to this because like we don't have a law for what you do with people who eat fetuses because nobody had done it before. So this was like so subversive that it was actually just kind of invisible. So Zhu Yu is one of these people who's kind of famously did this. Sun Yuan and Peng Yu are another one. They're important artists that you should all know about. So later they stopped. First they were using actual live, like dead baby bodies because it's disturbingly easy to get access to that in China. And then now they've moved to using sort of taxidermy models and so on. So you know this is a fallen angel that they made a few years ago. So there was a really intense endurance and performance art scene in Beijing especially, but also in Guangzhou and also in Sichuan, Chengdu, and also in Shanghai throughout the 90s. And they were clustered in these little villages. 798is one of them, 798. Songzhuang, I think there's a blue zone in Chengdu that was important. And it's as if the entire, for those of you who do art, it's as if the entire MoMA and everything was built on the remains of the East Village scene in the 80s. It's a huge infrastructure that just appears basically out of nowhere on a totally scattered and unorganized field. So that's some of the part of the reasons why it's hard to figure out exactly what counts and what doesn't count. And since 2008, you have these institutions that are trying to do that. So for example, Li, it's a magazine. It's nice, it's got texture on it. They've put a lot of, they're one of the institutions that are putting a lot of effort into canonizing and creating a solid core of what counts and what doesn't count. We can all talk about whether or not that's actually a legit thing for people to be doing. So those are some of the places that I was coming from. That was some of the knowledge that I had growing up in Beijing in the 90s and the 2000s, and then coming here and realizing firstly that people had no conception of what artists were working in China other than the usual, like the big three, the big four. And I wanted to think a little bit about what kinds of shows I could put on as a curator that would be interesting for people, and that also would be working with Chinese artists because I happen to know some of them and wanted to be working with them, and wanted to emphasize some of the specificities of the scene there that were different from here, because I think it's really, and also to emphasize the specificities of the scene here, but to find topics for them that were broad enough that it could fit a lot of people. And so one of the artists that I've worked a lot with recently is Zhang Yue. And so this is some part of the difficulties. You search Zhang Yue and like who's this guy over here? This curvy guy looking at me. One sec. Zhang Yue made a, he was, at the moment that he was supposed to go to the most prestigious art school in China, the Hangzhou school. I know some of you may be from the other school, but I always like to work with people from Hangzhou more, sorry. The year that he was supposed to go to that, he ended up getting a fight and seriously injuring someone. He was sent to jail instead for exactly 4 years, right, which was the time that he was supposed to be in school. So he got his art education in prison instead of in an art academy. And while he was there, art became not just art became an actual tool for him to reduce his sentence, among other things. So he would make paintings that then would be turned into informational pamphlets to distribute to the other prisoners. And that was a way of lessening his own sentence from 6 to 4 years and so on. And one of the things that he was really interested in doing while he was there was he made a series of pamphlets that were supposed to tell you. So it was basically why you should not escape. Right? There was a pamphlet like why you shouldn't escape from prison, and all the text was like your standard text, but the images were basically instructions for how to escape from prison. So it's like a series of exactly don't keep your spoon from the cafeteria, and then definitely don't remove the ceramic plates from behind that toilet, and definitely don't do that because you'll get in a lot of trouble. So it's kind of a manual for escape. So that was one of the things that he was trying to do. He was trying to use art as a way, firstly, to lessen his own sentence, but then also to develop tools for resistance as a prisoner. Something important about, so he's the guy on the right. One of the other projects that he worked on recently that was quite interesting to me was he was also making, he works a lot directly with the government, but he does it in a non-confrontational way. So for example, one of the things that the Chinese government has a really large censorship infrastructure in place, and one of the ways it does that is through really active screening by people. And so every state, every province has someone who's in charge of checking to see if something counts as pornographic or not, right? So there's someone who's like in charge of looking at all the videos and all the pictures that are marked as like huang, like yellow, like dirty, and saying like, that's actually just like someone wearing really short shorts, and like that is unacceptable. So someone does that like 8 hours a day, and they're in the police department. And apparently it's one of the hardest jobs to get. Like you have to pass a lot of tests to get in that position. And so one of the projects that he was working on was developing an objective system to measure whether or not, because they were working with images, to measure whether or not sounds were inappropriate. And so he developed a program which could measure whether a sound, a scream, was the sound of an orgasm, or whether it was the sound of something else, right? Like, for example, a bird or something like that. And that was something that he submitted directly to the government, saying, hey, you should really use this. Like, this would really help you. And so he's really obsessed with this idea of measuring sort of everyday experiences. And he claims that his program can also identify like false from real orgasms, which is, who knows, right? And he's like, you know, in porn, it's actually all real. Okay. So I was working with him, or starting to think about working with him. Sorry. He's in Beijing. He's in Haitian. Yeah. So, and if you want to know more about any of these artists, talk to me afterwards, because a lot of them aren't so easy to find online. And obviously, a lot of his work can't be publicly done because it's like actually treason. So I was thinking about working with him at the exact same time that that instances of police brutality in the United States and like became really got a lot of media attention in fall of last year. And at the same time that issues of mass incarceration were taking on a kind of national media presence. And so that was after Ferguson happened, after Staten Island happened. And I was working with this artist who had been coming from his own experiences working in prisons as someone who's sort of thinking about how to survive in prisons and then also how to infiltrate prisons, not with the aims of overturning it or anything, that's crazy and impossible, but with the aims of bettering the lives of people who are in it already. And so I started thinking about a show of artists working on incarceration in China, from China, and showing it in the United States. And this was actually at the same time, then I found out that Ai Weiwei had done something very similar. Do you guys know about the Alcatraz prison project? So he somehow got permission to do a project in Alcatraz, which of course is a symbolic, majorly important prison in the United States. It's like most prisons, it has beautiful views because it's far away from, far away from the city. It's like an isolated island off of San Francisco. And he did a show there. And what was interesting to me when I was looking at the show was that people are always like, the media always emphasizes how Ai Weiwei's work relates to the oppressiveness of the Chinese government. But Ai Weiwei himself is really insistent in his critique of all governments that are suppressing of individuals. So for example, he made concrete call-outs to Black Panthers, which was a black nationalist movement in the United States that was brutally suppressed by the FBI. He made explicit call-outs to them in this exhibition, but it's not something that gets picked up. It's something that falls in the cracks when the United States media covers it. So I was thinking about part of the reason that Chinese contemporary art has been so successful in the US is because it's been really useful for suggesting and if any of you read coverage about Chinese contemporary art, you'll know that things are often politicized when they don't need to be, or politicized incorrectly. Someone gave a great example of this morning at a talk I went to where they said that there was a food documentary that people had people argued was actually an instance of propaganda about multicultural solidarity, when it was really about being hungry, which is related but different. And so I was thinking about how do you do a show of artists from China who are working now without being used by a context that's always out to use you. So that's a project that I'm still working on. And here's another artist who's Xiangqian, who was made these kind of really beautiful gestural ink and gouache paintings while he was in prison as he's a philosopher who was put in prison for basically being right-leaning during the Cultural Revolution. So you can see it's like a really, Zhang Yuez was in prison in the early 2000s, Mu Xin was in prison in the 70s, someone like Ai Weiwei was in prison much in the 2005 or so. So that's one of the projects that I'm working on right now. And then one of the other projects I'm working on, and this is something I'm hoping to do more seriously in the coming month or two, is, I don't know if anyone knows who the Xiangqian group are. You probably know, right? Yeah, so the Xiangqian group is, they're 3 artists. One of the artists who's most well known is Zheng Guohu. Zheng Guohu is, I think one of his better known, he's done some really great works. A lot of things made out of bread, stir-fried. He's also did a really great work of, not him but a close friend, Zhou Xiaohu, did a great work where he had 20 private detectives, private investigators, and he set each one, he tasked each one with following like another one of them, and then they each videotaped each other, and so there was like this crazy 20 people, like citywide circle of people searching for each other, and he was one of them. So Zheng Guohu kind of comes from this background. He's one of these people who got forgotten in the 90s, or not quite, didn't quite get used. He wasn't useful enough in the 90s and 2000s, so he didn't quite get the international coverage. But he does amazing work about calligraphy, and he's really interesting because he's one of these people who is not trying, but happens to kind of bridge these 2 markets. One of the markets is usually really traditional, focused on drawing birds and branches. One of them is kind of like annoyingly non-traditional, where it's like two bricks and like an old underwear, like with a neon light, like floor and corner or something. Yeah, and this group, the Xiangqian group, are an interesting combination too, because they use calligraphy, but they use it. They're really interested in calligraphy as it traditionally was, as a form of communication, celebration, and often protest. Right? And so he's thinking about traditional, like the 大字报, right? Like the poster, the organizing poster about it as gifts, private gifts, or it as a commemoration for something important, or it as a political slogan for a movement. And so they do these. I think this is some kind of a. I think they're using ingredients for a chicken dish, kung pao chicken, and then they're making calligraphy for it. And they do these really messy, kind of crazy group collaboration projects where they invite a lot of people to come together and make this giant kind of party of a calligraphic piece. And they also live in a place. They're called the Xiangqian group because they retreated in the late 2000s, this town called Yangjiang, which kind of sounds like a nice place, but is actually like a total shithole. And it's a industrial town in Guangdong, fairly far inland, and it doesn't have any, it's really a very new city. It doesn't have anything really to recommend it, except that one of them was from there before. And so it's not like a retreat into the village or something, or to become a farmer. And while they were there, they started to improvise building a large architectural project. So this is something that they add something to sort of every couple of months. They're just like, oh, we need a new building, like a new room here. They just put it in. Like, oh, we need a big window here. So they just knock down a wall and they make a window. And they're like, oh, this needs to be blue, so they make it blue. And that's something you can do if you have access to cheap land and cheap labor like they do, being in this small industrial hinterland town. And they actually base their expansive designs on the video game Age of Empires. And so the reason I mention them is because one of the projects I'm really interested in working on now is a project about imperialism. Because now that Chinese artists are no longer working from a marginal position, but have, happen to be part of the I would say like the richest economy in the world. I mean, there's obviously the US is richer, but there's just more money floating. In China, there's more speculative money floating around. As that's happened, there's been a lot of cultural diplomacy. So there's a lot of expansion into Southeast Asia, into parts of Middle East and Africa. There's peacekeeping missions they're sending people on. And all of these things are raising the specter of cultural imperialism. And it's something that often there's a lot of defensiveness about when you talk to the Chinese people about it. But there's also a lot of pride in it, this idea that we're strong. So I'm really interested in doing a project about Chinese imperialism, but in a kind of, and one thing that let me show some of the people that I'm working on for that. people who I'm interested in working with for that isn't actually interested in imperialism or society at all, but is actually interested in biology. Because part of what makes imperialism interesting to me is its relationship to colonialism. And this is an artist who's interested in biological colonies. So when we talk about bacteria spreading, or when like cancer as a colony, or something that's separated, or even a plant as a colony, something that's separated and put somewhere else and it grows on its own accord, but it's still identical to the mother or the host. That's something that Lu Yang's interested in. And so Lu Yang recently had a great show in New York. And she worked a lot with this aesthetic. The word for it comes from Japan, and it's called kimokawa. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. Kimokawa means. So it means gross cute. Let me just find a good picture of it for you. And it's used to describe the feeling of some, maybe things like pimples with faces. So these are good examples of that. This is the jewelry she makes. So they kind of have they're lumpy and bright, but they have these little faces on them and you can wear them, and then she also has suits from them. And so she's really interested in these ideas of things growing on their own, kind of taking on their own life. Here's another picture of that kind of stuff. And those are called cancer babies. And one of her recent works, and I think this might be in Venice this year, she did a video game called Uterus Man. And Uterus Man is a video game about an infected womb that goes out to destroy other biologically inspired giant enemy villains. So she kind of has taken the body as she takes the body as her subject matter, and she thinks about how it relates to the digital world, and then she tries to make it fun or interesting or so exciting and kind of connects it to acid culture and things like that. So this is her working with Yuma Hamasaki, who's one of the most famous Japanese asexuals. Hamasaki had surgery to remove his genital organs, their genital organs, and they've had long collaboration together because that's one of the things that Lu Yang's really interested in, is how people change their own bodies, often in technological ways. She also did a project with frogs where she made them dance by applying electricity to them, these dead frogs. So I'm talking about a lot of artists with a really diverse kind of range of approaches. I'm talking about some of the ideas that I have for pulling them all together into a flexible but kind of reasonable single approach. And I wanted to include on one more artist because often there's a kind of a seriousness associated with Chinese contemporary artists, and often it's kind of associated with a certain kind of installation art or something. And I wanted to show an example of a really funny painter who was one of the people who popularized bad painting in China, Huaihua. So, for example, this is a painting that says justice. And so what he's doing in paintings like this is he's taking Chinese slogans, social slogans, an emphasis on, here's another one that says justice as well. It's a coughing chicken. There's a reference to the Monkey King. So he's taking these aspects, these slogans that are kind of floating around, and then he puts them into these contexts as captions, and they're obviously kind of silly and making fun of it, but there's also a kind of earnesty to them. So for example, what's this? Does anyone want to translate that? How would you translate that?
To forge iron, one must be strong.
Yeah. Right, to forge iron, one must be strong. So he has these things that are like kind of promotional and self-help, and they're ridiculous, but they're also really serious. And if you actually talk to him, he's really controlling about how you write about his work. You have to be serious about it, even though he's chosen to be seriously unserious. I can't see the writing. So those are some of the thoughts that I wanted to share with you, and now I wanted to open it to questions or specific thoughts that you all had, and suggestions, so that I can, prepare interesting shows going ahead. Yeah. Other things that you want to search for?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering about the role of, just sort of in this survey of like media, and especially like new media, which both in, the form of your presentation using Google to, it's convenient on one hand, but also I think, the way that we're able to have access to these works, or the way that they're disseminated internationally, probably also has to do with the internet, even though you were looking at specific institutional spaces for the talk. And then also, a lot of the works also, look at either video games or ways of modifying the body technologically. I just wonder if that's something you thought about like new media works versus, say, some of the sculptural works.
So one of the things about media that I think is interesting is that in the American context, fine art is haunted by the idea of medium specificity. I don't know if anyone knows what that term means, but it's a specific idea that a good artwork is something that reflects on its own medium. It's something that is about the way that it's made. And so it's something that really comes forward in the ideas of paintings, what's good about paintings in the 50s and the 40s. Like Jackson Pollock is a great example of a medium-specific artist. He does something that's essential to paint, which is that it can drip. Chinese artists don't have this historical hang-up. They have different kinds of historical baggage, which are related to socialist realist traditions. The idea is that art has to have a direct relationship to society. It has to mobilize people, be instrumental. And that's the relationship that some people are interested in. So there are some artists who are interested in medium, but it's not like in the United States where people are really obsessive with medium. People will make videos that are just about video. It's like a video of a video camera, like in a mirror, like going backwards, or something like that, right, for like 80 minutes. One of my favorite things to do is make up like fake art that I can then criticize, which is like totally unfair. So that's one example. And so those questions about sort of the historical hangover of socialist realism and the idea that art should do something and can do something is something these artists all engage with really differently. Like Liao Guohe obviously thinks that art can't really do anything, so he's got this kind of despairing, kind of humorous billions of paintings practice. Or Lu Yang thinks that art can literally change your body. You can actually technologically change how you're built. So there's someone else, Sun Yuan and Peng Yu, who I showed you earlier. Sun Yuan has this. One of the works this is a good one. This is world leader, like models of world leaders asleep as older people in automatic armchairs that like roll around and bump into each other. So it's their allegory of world politics, right? It's like a bunch of old people asleep and like bumping into each other. But one of the things they had done earlier was they had this one of their pieces, which is people blindfolded changing or reassembling guns. And Sun Yun is obsessed with guns, and that was something that was problematic for me when I first met him because coming from the United States, it's like guns aren't something that you want to see more of. But he's obsessed with guns and he wants more of them. So every time he goes to a new country and he gets a collector, he'll make artworks, which are basically, his collectors will buy guns and he'll sign them. And then he'll leave a contract with them saying that one day, when China changes its laws and it's legal to have a gun, he will get all those guns back. So I've talked to him about it, and he says that he has 300 guns, like all over the world, including rocket launchers and grenades. He can have a small army if he wants. And so he thinks of his art practice as like literally a way to get what he wants, which in this case is guns. And he wants guns because it's associated with him with the idea of like, he's kind of a libertarian approach. It's an idea of like, the government shouldn't be able to tell me what to do. I don't really know why I want guns, but I should be allowed to have them even if I won't want them once I'm allowed to have them. So there's all these ways that these art practices are actually being used in literal, specific, and and ways that are more than just about themselves.
So what do you think of plagiarism in Chinese art world? Because like recently I think Ai Weiwei is criticized. Like I think one of his performing art piece, like Tonghua, is like, I think none of the artists say that it's actually a copy of his none of the art, but I can't really recall the name of that performing art piece, which is like transforming 3 people from one place to another, like on plane. So what do you think of that?
1,000 people.
It's like Ai Weiwei's art is like 1,000 people, but the other artist is just 3 people.
Yeah, plagiarism is a good question. There's a lot of anxiety about being derivative and being sad, and people really want to be new and creative. Obviously, you never know if someone's done something before you. I think many of the artists that I look at and pay attention to have made art that's similar to art that other people have made, but it's over the course of a career it can become interesting on its own. I think that Ai Weiwei's case that's not necessarily true. And there haven't been like major cases of copyright infringement or something like that, like a lawsuit against an artist for doing something.
I'm curious about how many of the artists are like Ai Weiwei's, because I feel like a lot of contemporary Chinese artists are all Ai Weiwei. And like, what do you see?
So Ai Weiwei means someone who like studied abroad or like lived abroad and came back. It's really a generational thing. There's like a real clear generational. There's like real clear generations in Chinese contemporary art because like teacher relationships are really important. And so I think what you're seeing now is like with people like Wu Yang who